Hey guys, how's it going? I just wanted to take this opportunity real quick to first, thanks for watching this video, for clicking on that button. Second of all, we worked really hard on this video, almost a year and a half on this video, worked our butts off. This video is based on our own personal experiences working in the industry, based off friends that still to this day work in the industry, and we also did a lot of research for updated info, just to make sure that the updated info is still legit that we have in this video. I also want to give a huge shout out to Casey Cosley, who lent her voice to this video. Huge appreciation for that. So thanks, she's awesome. Go check her out on our Twitter and her YouTube. Her links will be down below in the description. She's a big movie lover, so check her YouTube channel out and her Twitter feed. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoy the video. It's about 19 minutes long, so stay for the whole thing. It's really in-depth, informational. And hope you enjoy it. So guys, there has been a lot of debate recently about frame rates. Mainly people exclaiming that the 24 frames per second is a dead frame rate, and you should be using 60 frames per second or even higher, because movies are now shot digitally, and the 24 frames per second is just old Hollywood stuck in the past. Well, is this necessarily true? Why does Hollywood still use 24 frames per second as the standard, especially in today's technology advancement in film? Well, today we're going to answer that very question.
Part 1. Frame rates, a visual history.
So to start off, we need to dig deep into the brief history of frame rates and what separates one from the other. Now, of course, I could easily talk more than an hour or so on this subject, but honestly, we don't have time for that. Nobody does, except for me, but I'm not going to bore you guys with it. Instead, anyways, I'm going to try to break this down as simply as I can. First, let's answer what a frame rate is. I like to liken it to a comic book. Each picture, each drawing is considered a frame of the story. Each frame tells the story of what's happening. Or you can also liken it to, if you have ever seen, or if you yourself has drawn pictures on pieces of paper, and then you put those papers in order and flip through them real fast, well, it looks like the pictures are in movement to tell the story. The faster the person flips through the pages, the faster the movement becomes and the more real it looks. Same is true with film. Each frame holds an image that was shot to tell the story. In a nutshell, that's what a frame rate is. Just a bunch of images moving very fast to create motion. So the question is, how did Hollywood, first of all, come to fix on 24 frames per second in the first place? Well, the history of frame rates in Hollywood can be a little complex, but I'm going to try to do it as briefly as I can and simply. To start off, it's a scientific fact. The human brain can only perceive 10 to 12 individual images per second. And that's just one single image as we look around in our environment. Any faster than 10 to 12 frames per second, then our brain is tricked into seeing these images moving. Now, the inventor of film, Mr. Thomas Edison himself, was well aware of this. So then how fast does a film projector need to run to make each image or frame show motion without going too fast or too slow? Because too fast would just create a bunch of blur images together. Well, when a movie is shown through film, because the film strip has so many images, there are black spaces in between each frame. And this inevitably causes a problem. If you ran a projector at, say, 12 frames per second, it created flashes in between those blank spots of the film strip instead of a smooth playback. After messing around with different frame rates, Edison discovered that the perfect frame rate to solve this issue is running it at 46 frames per second, and it worked. Everything was smooth and it looked like a smooth motion. Until Edison discovered that actually shooting a film at 46 frames per second meant you would have to go through reels and reels and reels of film stock just to make a movie, which would be extremely expensive and overall just not feasible. While Edison went back to the drawing board, theater projectionists themselves took matters into their own hands and decided, instead of showing just one frame at a time, why not show the same frame more than once, overlapping it? And that was the answer. They had no more rapid flashes and had smooth playback, while the studios shot at a cheaper frame rate, keeping the expenses down, and everything was great. But then there was a major boom in Hollywood that changed Hollywood films forever.
Part 2. The Sound Era.
Now, during the early days of Hollywood, all was grand. The projectionists found a way to solve the rapid flashing issue with the film strips, and the studios were able to shoot films in an inexpensive way. In the late 1920s, a new technology was on the rise with the invention of sound on film.
You are now listening to a talking moving picture whose synchronism is not only perfect but foolproof.
Now you can hear what actors are actually saying on screen. No need for subtitles, no need for a house piano player. It was an amazing achievement. However, it wasn't just as simple as transferring from silent film over to sound. You see, when audio is recorded on a film strip, it's actually recorded on the same film strip as the images being shot, as an optical track that runs alongside the image of the film. Doing this keeps the images and sound in sync. The problem was, you had to shoot at a very even frame rate, otherwise the audio would be out of sync of the motion, the people, the actors in the film. At 16 frames per second, the audio didn't have enough fidelity and it just sounded bad. But at 12 frames per second, the audio sounded perfect. So thinking to how projectionists would double the frame rate, 12 plus 12 is 24. And thus 24 frames per second was born! And therefore 24 frames per second became the standard for all filmmaking, not just in Hollywood but also worldwide. But then in 2004, things started to change in Hollywood that gave Hollywood another surprise.
Part 3. The Digital Boom.
Today, technology has advanced so much, majority of theaters no longer even use actual film projectors. It's now all digital, where the movie can be plugged in using a thumb drive. And Hollywood, for the most part, no longer uses film to shoot with. Now it's all digital format being used, with some exceptions here and there. So since movies are now shot digitally, why not dump the old standard of 24 frames per second and take full advantage of the digital technology we have today? Well, now this is a question that many have asked me over the years, and I still hear it down today, and I see it all over social media as well. I hear things like, modern advancements in digital technology has made 24 frames per second obsolete. Now guys, this type of thinking is just simply not true. I found majority of people who have this mentality are mainly gamers. Since games use movie-like sections called cutscenes to help tell the story, it's known that these are shown in a 60 frames per second. So then it's only logical that since a video game can have lifelike movies shot on film at 60 frames per second, then of course the theatrical movies can too. Well, there is a great article I found from the leading online gaming magazine that talks about this very issue. It's from IGN, and the article states, one of the biggest problems with 60 frames per second is having to have twice as many pixels. And there's also other layers to it that people just do not consider or fully understand. It requires a lot more work, a lot more man hours, and more of everything. Unlike film, where films are shot and run at 24 frames per second, is a much easier frame rate to work with, and honestly just overall looks better. If you shot a feature film in 60 frames per second, it would be incredibly expensive. Also, it would look pixelated, and the motion would just look jarring on the big screen, and also on the small screen itself. Another question I get is, TVs have always shot shows at 60 frames per second since the early 50s, and it looks fine, so why can't movies? Well, you have to understand, it's shot in 60i. The I stands for interlaced, meaning the show is effectively running at 30 frames per second, interlaced with 30 frames per second, making it 60 frames per second, or in TV language, 60 hertz. The problem became after the HD 1680p digital boom era in 2004-2005. This 60 hertz or 60 frames per second became known as the soap opera effect. Shows and movies shown at 60 hertz or 60 frames per second looked very jarring and has this very cheap TV look to it. So because of this, studios started shooting TV shows and TV movies at 24 frames per second, which solved the issue. And shooting 24 frames per second, studios also found it gave TV shows and movies a richer cinematic look. So guys, saying TV shows are in 60 frames per second is pretty inaccurate now. But yet there's another bigger reason why 24 frames per second is still the staple in filmmaking.
Part 4, 60 frames per second versus 24 frames per second.
We have come into the 4K era. And if you shot a film in raw 4K at 24 frames per second, that gives you about 1.33 terabytes per hour. On the other hand, if you shot a film in raw 4K at 60 frames per second, it vastly changes from 1.33 terabytes per hour to a whopping 3.3 terabytes per hour, which means that I would need 2.5 times more data and storage space just to film in 60 frames per second than I would at 24 frames per second. And that's assuming your movie is under 2 hours. Now you might say, well, so what? Just go out and buy relatively cheap hard drives and get a bunch of them and problem solved. Or I could save the data storage space and shoot in 24 frames per second. You will always fit more at 24 frames per second on a hard drive than you will at 60 frames per second. It just all around saves you a lot of time and money, especially when you're shooting on a tight budget and a timeline. Guys, you have to remember the studio isn't dealing with just running down to your local Best Buy and picking up a couple of hard drives. In fact, no matter how many hard drives it would take to put raw 24 frames per second footage onto it, it would require 2 times that many hard drives at 60 frames per second. Also remember, studios don't shoot just 1 or 2 movies at a time. They have multiple movies shooting simultaneously. So this would mean hundreds and hundreds, countless of hard drives storing multiple productions every single day. It also means twice more manpower, twice more work hours, twice more of just everything. And that's just the start. Now during production, since you're putting that much data from the camera sensor onto a card, you will need very fast storage cards. And honestly guys, these do not come cheap at all. And you would need hundreds, if not thousands of cards shooting at 60 frames per second. And then of course you need backup to back up all your footage. So whatever the cost was for all the hard drives before, you would need to triple it. So now it's not just twice everything, it's literally 3 times the storage space, 3 times the man hours and manpower, and 3 times of everything. Now it's true, some studios do upload to servers on a cloud instead of hard drives, but then that means you would need 2.5 times more bandwidth and also 2.5 times more wait time just to upload the footage to the cloud. And then comes post-production. When editing all this footage at 60 frames per second, the whole department, which is sometimes hundreds of hands, will all need beefier, faster computers to just handle all the footage, because now you have to move 2.5 times more footage to the hard drives or download from the cloud to graphic processors and so on. And then you have to worry about rendering motion graphics like rotoscoping, animation, CG, green screen, blue screen effects, color grading, the list goes on and on. And all this footage at 60 frames per second means you now have to render at 2.5 times more frames. The render time would be 2 to 3 times longer than it would if you were rendering just 24 frames per second, which would also mean that the release date would have to be pushed in order to do that. And then when the film is finally done and ready to be shipped off, At 60 frames per second, you now need 2.5 times more storage on each DCPs, which stands for digital cinema packages that are delivered and shipped to movie theaters. So again, you would need 2.5 times more storage for theatrical distribution. And if your film is just going to streaming, well, this means that streaming companies would likewise need 2.5 times more bandwidth. And that is expensive. As an example, guys, Netflix already is using 35% of the world's bandwidth just with 24 frames per second TV and movies. How much bandwidth would they need to stream at 60 frames per second? It's way more, and it's just not feasible. And all of this is because you choose to shoot your films at 60 frames per second instead of the standard 24 frames per second. And congratulations, you just bankrupt the studio. But now you may ask yourself, what about shooting with a camera that can compress your footage into 60 frames per second to run in the same data rate as 24 frames per second? I mean, that would work and solve all the problems, right? Yeah, think about that for a moment. This would mean that each frame is more and more compressed, meaning each frame now loses, 1, its integrity, and 2, the high HD quality of the image and sound. It's now lost. So as a filmmaker, why would you want to sacrifice the quality of your film just to compress it from 60 frames per second to run as 24 frames per second? It would make absolutely no sense. So why not just shoot in 24 frames per second and maintain the quality of your film?
Part 5. Conclusion.
From the start of the invention of sound in film to The Godfather to Star Wars, from Indiana Jones to Schindler's List, from Titanic to Avengers Endgame, from classic films from Bergman to the 60s to 70s Japanese and exploitation films, to Italian giallo films, to the biggest budgeted films, down to the smallest independent shoestring budget films, they are all shot at 24 frames per second. Now I'm sure if you dug around, you'll find some exceptions. Around the World in 80 Days, The Hobbit, but look how that turned out for them. Majority of theaters just ended up showing it at a compressed 24 frames per second because people complained about how it looked. It looked very jarring and jittery. But this makes me curious, guys. Are any of your favorite films not at 24 frames per second? Throw them down in the comment section and let me know. In any case, make no mistake, 24 frames per second is the standard around the globe. All films are shot and always will be shot at 24 frames per second for all the reasons we just discussed. It just makes sense to do so from all perspectives. As always, guys, thanks so much for supporting this channel here. We wouldn't have been able to grow as much as we have been without you guys, so thanks to all you guys. And as always, we'll see you in the future.